the gun down, sweetie, before you hurt yourself.
The waitress said calmly, refilling the armed robber's coffee cup like nothing had happened. The entire diner froze. Customers ducked under tables. The gunman stared in disbelief at the middle-aged woman in a stained apron who had just walked straight into his line of fire without breaking stride. Everyone thought Becca Morgan was just another small-town waitress who'd been serving pie and coffee at Murphy's Diner for the past 3 years. But when that robber made the mistake of threatening her customers, something shifted in Becca's voice that made even hardened criminals take a step back. What happened next would reveal why this unassuming waitress carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had talked dangerous people out of much worse situations. If you've ever been underestimated because of your job, hit that subscribe button. Sometimes the most ordinary people have the most extraordinary backgrounds. Murphy's Diner sat on the corner of Main and 5th Street in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a town so small that everyone knew everyone else's business except when it came to Rebecca Morgan. The red vinyl booths had seen better days. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, and the pie was legendary among truckers who made regular stops along Route 15. Becca had been working the morning shift for 3 years, arriving before dawn to prep the coffee and staying until the lunch rush died down around 2 in the afternoon. To the regular customers, she was exactly what a small-town waitress should be: reliable, friendly, and forgettable. She remembered how everyone liked their coffee, knew which truckers preferred their eggs over easy and which ones wanted their bacon crispy, and could balance 6 plates on her arms while navigating the narrow aisles between tables. Her graying brown hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore the same faded pink uniform every day, complete with a name tag that simply read Becca in cheerful letters. The customers at Murphy's Diner represented a cross-section of small-town America. There was Harold Kowalski, a retired factory worker who came in every morning at 6:30 for black coffee and wheat toast, always sitting in the same booth by the window where he could watch the sunrise paint the mountains in the distance. Margaret Shun, who ran the flower shop next door, stopped by for her usual vanilla latte and blueberry muffin before opening her store at 9. The truckers came and went like migrating birds, following routes that took them across the country, but always bringing them back to Murphy's for Becca's famous apple pie and coffee that could fuel a cross-country haul. What none of them knew was that Rebecca Morgan wasn't her real name, and her background involved skills that went far beyond balancing plates and memorizing coffee orders. For 15 years before arriving in Millbrook, she had worked for the FBI's crisis negotiation team, specializing in hostage situations where her voice was often the only thing standing between life and death. She had talked armed suspects out of convenience stores, negotiated the release of kidnapped children, and defused situations that could have resulted in national tragedies if they had gone wrong. Her retirement from the FBI hadn't been voluntary. 3 years ago, a situation in Chicago had gone sideways when local law enforcement had ignored her advice and stormed a building where a desperate father was holding his ex-wife and children. The resulting tragedy had cost 2 lives and destroyed Becca's faith in the system she had served for over a decade. The official report had blamed communication failures and tactical errors, but Becca knew the truth. Sometimes the people who were supposed to protect others made decisions based on politics rather than safety. After Chicago, Becca had submitted her resignation and disappeared into the anonymous landscape of small-town America, looking for a place where she could serve coffee instead of dealing with life-and-death decisions. Millbrook had welcomed her without questions, and Murphy's Diner had given her the kind of simple, honest work that helped her sleep at night without seeing the faces of the people she hadn't been able to save. The owner of Murphy's Diner was Frank Castellano, a 68-year-old Italian-American whose family had run the place for 3 generations. Frank had hired Becca on the spot when she walked in looking for work, impressed by her professional demeanor and the way she could handle the morning rush without breaking a sweat. He never asked about her past, and she never volunteered information beyond what was necessary for employment paperwork that showed clean background checks and references that were real but carefully sanitized. Frank appreciated Becca's work ethic and the way she handled difficult customers with a calm professionalism that seemed unusual for someone working in a small-town diner. When truckers got too loud or drunk locals became belligerent, Becca had a way of defusing tensions before they could escalate into real problems. Frank assumed she had learned these skills from years of waitressing in busier establishments, never suspecting that her training had come from FBI courses on crisis de-escalation and psychological manipulation. The morning of Tuesday, November 15th, started like any other at Murphy's Diner. Becca arrived at 5:30 to start the coffee and prep the breakfast special, a task she had performed over 1,000 times since starting work at the restaurant. The familiar routine of grinding coffee, checking the grill, and setting up the dining room provided a meditative quality that helped her start each day with purpose and focus. Harold Kowalski arrived at his usual time, followed by Margaret Chen and the early shift workers from the manufacturing plant on the outskirts of town. The morning proceeded with the comfortable predictability that Becca had grown to appreciate after years of unpredictable crises and emergency situations that could change without warning. She poured coffee, took orders, and engaged in the kind of small talk that formed the social fabric of small-town life. Around 9:15, a man Becca had never seen before entered the diner. He was in his mid-30s, wearing a worn leather jacket and jeans that had seen better days. His hair was unkempt, and he moved with the nervous energy of someone who hadn't slept in days. He took a seat at the counter, ordered black coffee, and sat staring into the cup without drinking while his leg bounced under the stool with restless anxiety. Becca's training kicked in automatically as she observed the stranger's behavior patterns. His constant scanning of the room, the way he positioned himself near the exit, and his reluctance to make eye contact with other customers suggested someone who was either running from something or planning something. She had seen these behavioral indicators countless times during her FBI career, and they triggered professional instincts that retirement hadn't diminished. The man sat at the counter for nearly an hour, nursing the same cup of coffee while the diner filled with the usual morning crowd. Becca kept him in her peripheral vision while serving other customers, noting how his anxiety seemed to increase as more people entered the restaurant. When Margaret Chen's cheerful laughter rang out from her usual booth, the stranger flinched as if the sound had been a gunshot, confirming Becca's growing suspicion that he was in some kind of crisis situation. Around 10:30, just as the breakfast rush was winding down and the diner had settled into its mid-morning lull, the stranger reached into his jacket and pulled out a small revolver. The weapon was old and showed signs of poor maintenance, but it was loaded and functional enough to be dangerous in the hands of someone who was desperate or unstable. He stood up from the counter stool and turned to face the dining room, his hand shaking as he pointed the gun toward the assembled customers. "Nobody move," he shouted, his voice cracking with stress and exhaustion. "This is a robbery. Everyone stay calm and nobody gets hurt." The reaction was immediate and predictable. Harold Kowalski dove under his table, knocking over his coffee cup in the process. Margaret Chin screamed and pressed herself against the back of her booth, trying to make herself as small as possible. Two truckers who had been discussing freight routes suddenly found themselves crawling behind the counter, hoping to find cover that might protect them from whatever was about to happen. The gunman's attention was focused on the cash register and the terrified customers, which gave Becca the opportunity to assess the situation using skills that had been dormant for 3 years but remained sharp from years of intensive training. She could see that he was amateur, probably desperate for money rather than experienced in violent crime. His grip on the weapon was incorrect, his stance was unstable, and his emotional state was volatile enough that he could accidentally discharge the firearm even if he didn't intend to hurt anyone. What happened next defied every instinct that the customers and even the gunman expected in a robbery situation. Instead of complying with his demands or hiding behind the counter like a normal person would do, Becca picked up the coffee pot from the warming plate and walked directly toward the armed man as if she were simply approaching another customer who needed a refill. "Put the gun down, sweetie, before you hurt yourself," she said in the same tone she might use to suggest that someone try the daily special. She moved with deliberate calm, showing no fear or recognition that she was walking into a potentially lethal situation that could end with multiple casualties. The gunman stared at her in complete bewilderment, his weapon wavering as he tried to process the surreal experience of having a middle-aged waitress approach him with a coffee pot while he was attempting to commit armed robbery. The other customers watched in horrified fascination as Becca continued walking until she was close enough to refill his cup, which she did with the same casual efficiency she brought to every aspect of her job. "Ma'am, I have a gun," the robber said, as if Becca might not have noticed the weapon he was pointing in her general direction. "I can see that, honey," Becca replied, setting the coffee pot on the counter and fixing him with the kind of steady gaze that had convinced hardened criminals to surrender during her FBI career. "But you don't really want to use it, do you?" The transformation in her voice was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to listen for such things. The friendly waitress tone was replaced by something more authoritative, a quality that suggested she was accustomed to being obeyed in dangerous situations. The gunman felt the shift even if he couldn't identify what had changed, and his confidence began to waver as he realized that this wasn't going according to any script he had imagined. Becca studied the man's face with the clinical assessment skills that had made her one of the FBI's most effective negotiators. She could see the exhaustion in his bloodshot eyes, the tremor in his hands that suggested drug withdrawal or extreme stress, and the desperation that came from someone who had run out of legal options. These were signs she had learned to read during hundreds of crisis situations where understanding the subject's psychological state was the key to preventing violence. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that invited confession rather than resistance. "Danny," he answered automatically, then seemed surprised that he had responded to her question instead of maintaining control of the situation. "Well, Danny, I'm Becca," she said, extending her hand as if they were being introduced at a church social rather than during an armed robbery. "How long since you've had a good meal?" Danny stared at her outstretched hand, his gun still pointed toward the dining room, but his attention now completely focused on the woman who seemed determined to treat him like a customer rather than a criminal. The disconnect between his expectations and the reality of the situation was creating a psychological state that Becca recognized as an opportunity to establish the kind of rapport that could resolve the crisis without violence. "I'm not hungry," Danny said, though his hollow cheeks and the way his clothes hung on his frame suggested otherwise. "When did you last sleep?" Becca continued, ignoring his denial while she evaluated his responses for information that might help her understand what had driven him to this point. "Lady, this is a robbery," Danny said, waving the gun as if to remind her of the seriousness of the situation. "You're supposed to be scared." "I know, sweetie," Becca replied with the patience of someone who had dealt with much more dangerous people than a desperate young man with a shaky grip on an old revolver. "But you're not really a robber, are you? This isn't something you planned out or practiced. You're just scared and you need help." The accuracy of her assessment hit Danny like a physical blow, and for a moment his facade of dangerous criminality cracked enough to reveal the frightened young man underneath. Becca could see the exact moment when his resolve began to crumble, and she pressed her advantage with the psychological techniques that had saved lives in situations far more volatile than a small-town diner robbery. "Whatever's wrong, we can figure it out," she said, her voice carrying the kind of conviction that came from years of talking people back from the edge of desperation. "But first, you need to put that gun down before someone gets hurt accidentally." Danny's hand began to shake more violently as the adrenaline of the robbery attempt started to wear off and the reality of his situation became clear. He was trapped in a diner full of witnesses, holding a weapon he didn't really want to use, facing a woman who seemed completely unafraid of him despite the obvious danger he represented. The plan that had seemed desperate but possible an hour ago now looked like the kind of mistake that would destroy whatever remained of his life. "I can't go to prison," Danny said, his voice breaking as the weight of his situation became clear. "You're not going to prison," Becca said with the certainty of someone who had negotiated dozens of similar surrenders. "You haven't hurt anyone, and you're going to put that gun down right now before this gets any worse." The authority in her voice was unmistakable now, carrying the weight of professional training and years of experience in crisis situations. Danny found himself responding to that authority despite his desperate circumstances, his hand slowly lowering the weapon as Becca's psychological pressure overcame his rational fear of the consequences. "That's it," Becca said as the gun dropped toward the floor. "You're doing the right thing, Danny. Everything's going to be okay." She moved forward and gently took the weapon from his unresisting hand, engaging the safety with the practiced motion of someone who had disarmed subjects before. The crisis was over as suddenly as it had begun, and the diner erupted in relieved chatter as customers realized they were no longer in danger from the young man who now sat slumped on a counter stool with his head in his hands. When the police arrived 15 minutes later, they found Danny sitting peacefully at the counter with Becca, serving him a plate of eggs and bacon while he told her about the medical bills that had driven him to desperation and the job he had lost when his mother's cancer treatment had required him to miss too much work. The weapon was secured behind the counter, and the situation was completely under control thanks to a waitress who had handled an armed robbery with the kind of professional competence that surprised everyone present. Officer Maria Santos, the first responder to the scene, had expected to find either casualties or a barricaded suspect when she received the armed robbery call. Instead, she walked into a diner where a middle-aged waitress was calmly taking a statement from a cooperative suspect while serving him breakfast and ensuring that he understood his rights and options for legal representation during the booking process. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to step away from the suspect," Officer Santos said, following standard procedures for securing a crime scene. "Of course," Becca replied, but not before placing a reassuring hand on Danny's shoulder and reminding him that cooperation with the police would be noted favorably when his case went to court. Her knowledge of legal procedures and criminal justice protocols was more detailed than most civilians would possess, but Officer Santos was too focused on processing the scene to notice the implications of Becca's expertise. As Danny was being handcuffed and read his rights, he looked back at Becca with something approaching gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly, understanding that she had probably saved him from making a mistake that would have ruined his life permanently. Becca simply nodded and began cleaning up the coffee that Harold Kowalski had spilled when he dove under his table, returning to her normal routine as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The other customers watched her with new respect and curiosity, realizing that there was more to their quiet waitress than anyone had suspected. Officer Santos completed her initial assessment of the scene and began taking statements from witnesses, but she found herself increasingly intrigued by Becca's behavior during the incident. The waitress had handled the situation with a level of professional calm that suggested training or experience that went far beyond normal civilian capabilities, and her knowledge of crisis negotiation techniques was sophisticated enough to make Santos wonder about her background. "Ma'am, can I speak with you privately?" Officer Santos asked when she had finished interviewing the other witnesses. Becca followed the officer to a quiet booth in the back of the diner, knowing that this conversation was inevitable and hoping that it wouldn't lead to questions that she wasn't prepared to answer. 3 years of anonymity in Millbrook had given her the peace and quiet she had needed to recover from the trauma of her FBI career, but she had always known that her skills might surface again if the right situation presented itself. "Ms. Morgan, what you did today was extraordinary," Officer Santos began. "That kind of crisis negotiation usually requires specialized training. Can you tell me about your background?" Becca considered her options carefully, weighing the benefits of continued anonymity against the potential consequences of lying to a police officer during an official investigation. Her cover identity was solid enough to withstand casual scrutiny, but a determined investigation might uncover connections that would expose her real identity and bring unwanted attention from her former colleagues at the FBI. "I worked in crisis counseling before I came to Millbrook," Becca said, which was technically true even if it omitted crucial details about the nature of her previous employment. "You pick up certain skills when you're dealing with people in desperate situations." Officer Santos accepted this explanation, though something in Becca's demeanor suggested that there was more to the story than she was revealing. The professional way she had handled the negotiation, her knowledge of proper procedures for securing evidence, and her obvious familiarity with criminal justice processes indicated training that went beyond civilian crisis counseling programs. The incident at Murphy's Diner became the talk of Millbrook within hours, with details growing more dramatic with each retelling. By evening, Becca had been credited with everything from disarming a gang of armed robbers to single-handedly preventing a massacre, though the truth was impressive enough without embellishment. She had used professional skills to defuse a dangerous situation and possibly saved several lives, including that of the desperate young man who had been driven to crime by circumstances beyond his control. Frank Castellano was particularly impressed by his employee's performance during the crisis, though he was puzzled by her calm reaction to a situation that would have traumatized most people. When he asked her about it later, Becca simply said that she had dealt with difficult people before and knew how to stay calm under pressure, which was true but understated the reality of her experience. The local newspaper ran a story about the incident under the headline, "Local Waitress Talks Down Armed Robber," but Becca declined to be interviewed or photographed, claiming that she didn't want any publicity for doing what anyone would have done in the same situation. Her insistence on anonymity struck some people as modest, but it was actually a calculated decision to avoid the kind of media attention that might attract the notice of people who knew her real identity. Danny Coleman, as he turned out to be named, was charged with attempted armed robbery but received a lenient sentence due to his cooperation with police and the testimony of character witnesses who spoke about his desperate circumstances and lack of criminal history. The judge noted that the peaceful resolution of the incident was largely due to the intervention of a citizen who had shown remarkable courage and skill in defusing what could have been a tragedy. 3 months after the incident, Becca was serving the usual morning crowd when a familiar face appeared at the counter. Agent Jennifer Walsh from the FBI's regional office had tracked down her former colleague after hearing about the diner incident through law enforcement channels that connected local police reports with federal databases containing information about agents with crisis negotiation training. "Hello, Rebecca," Agent Walsh said, using the name that Becca hadn't heard spoken aloud for over 3 years. Becca's hand didn't shake as she poured coffee, but she felt the familiar tension that came from being discovered by people she had hoped never to see again. Agent Walsh was one of the few people who had supported her decision to resign after the Chicago incident, but her presence in Millbrook could only mean that the FBI had need of Becca's skills for something that couldn't be handled through normal channels. "Agent Walsh," Becca acknowledged, setting down the coffee pot and preparing for a conversation she had been dreading since the day she had submitted her resignation. "I'm surprised to see you here." "We need to talk," Agent Walsh said quietly, glancing around the diner to ensure that their conversation wouldn't be overheard by customers who knew Becca only as their friendly neighborhood waitress. They moved to a corner booth where they could speak privately, and Agent Walsh explained that a situation had developed that required Becca's specific expertise in crisis negotiation. A domestic terrorist group had taken hostages at a federal building, and their demands included negotiating only with Rebecca Morgan, whose reputation in certain circles had made her a requested mediator for extremist groups who distrusted other federal agents. "They specifically asked for you by name," Agent Walsh explained. "Apparently your work in Chicago made an impression on some people who have connections to this group. They trust you to negotiate in good faith because of how you handled that situation, even though it didn't end the way anyone wanted." Becca listened to the details of the hostage situation with the clinical assessment skills that had never really left her, despite 3 years of serving coffee and pie to truck drivers and retirees. The terrorist group was small but well-armed. Their hostages included federal employees and civilian visitors, and the situation had already dragged on for 18 hours without resolution through normal negotiation channels. "I'm retired," Becca said, though her tone lacked conviction even to her own ears. "People are going to die if this goes wrong," Agent Walsh replied. "You know as well as I do that some situations require specific skills that can't be replicated through training or experience. This is one of those situations." The decision that Becca faced was between the peaceful anonymity she had built in Millbrook and the possibility of preventing the kind of tragedy that had haunted her since Chicago. She thought about Danny Coleman and how her intervention had probably saved his life and the lives of the diner customers who could have been hurt if the situation had escalated. Some skills were too important to keep hidden when people needed help. "How long do I have to decide?" Becca asked, knowing that she had already made her choice, but needing time to arrange for coverage of her shifts at the diner. "The situation is deteriorating rapidly," Agent Walsh said. "We need to move within the next few hours if we're going to have any chance of ending this peacefully." Becca nodded and looked around the diner where she had found peace and purpose for 3 years, knowing that accepting this assignment would probably end her quiet life in Millbrook, but unable to ignore the possibility of saving lives with skills that few people possessed. She had become a waitress to escape the weight of responsibility that came with crisis negotiation, but some responsibilities couldn't be escaped when people needed help. An hour later, Becca was on a helicopter heading toward a federal building where armed terrorists were holding innocent people hostage, carrying equipment and credentials that identified her as FBI Special Agent Rebecca Morgan rather than the small-town waitress that Millbrook knew as Becca. The transformation was complete, and she was returning to the work that had defined her professional life before tragedy had driven her into retirement. The hostage situation was resolved successfully after 14 hours of negotiation, with all hostages released unharmed and the terrorists surrendering peacefully to federal authorities. Becca's reputation as one of the most effective crisis negotiators in federal law enforcement was restored, and she was offered a return to active duty with the FBI Crisis Negotiation Team at a salary and rank that reflected her years of experience and proven effectiveness. She declined the offer and returned to Millbrook, where Murphy's Diner had been running smoothly under temporary management but clearly needed her back to maintain the level of service that customers expected. Frank Castellano didn't ask questions about her brief absence, and Becca didn't volunteer information about where she had been or what she had been doing during her time away from the restaurant. The regular customers at Murphy's Diner noticed that Becca seemed different after her return, carrying herself with even greater confidence and purpose than before. She still served coffee and pie with the same friendly efficiency, but there was an additional quality to her interactions that suggested she had been reminded of her own capabilities and value in ways that went beyond the appreciation of satisfied customers. 6 months later, Becca was training other FBI agents in crisis negotiation techniques during her off hours from the diner, using her experience to help develop the next generation of federal agents who would face similar situations. She had found a way to balance the peaceful life she had built in Millbrook with the meaningful work that utilized her specialized skills to help people in crisis situations. Today, Becca continues to serve coffee and pie at Murphy's Diner while maintaining her connection to the FBI as a consultant and trainer for agents who specialize in crisis negotiation and hostage situations. Her dual identity allows her to live the quiet life she values while contributing her expertise to preventing tragedies and saving lives in situations where her voice might be the difference between life and death. The customers at Murphy's Diner still don't know about Becca's background with the FBI, but they understand that their waitress is someone special who brings more than just professional service to her work. Her presence makes the diner feel safer and more welcoming, and her ability to handle difficult situations with calm professionalism has become part of the restaurant's reputation among travelers and locals alike. If you've watched this story to the end, you understand that the most extraordinary people often hide in the most ordinary places, serving coffee and pie while carrying skills that could save lives in the right circumstances. Becca's journey from FBI crisis negotiator to small-town waitress and back to consultant reminds us that retirement from important work doesn't always mean the end of meaningful service, and that sometimes the most valuable people are the ones we see every day without recognizing their true capabilities. Her willingness to risk her peaceful anonymity to help people in desperate situations proves that some skills are too important to waste, and that heroism often comes disguised as ordinary kindness and professional competence. If stories like Becca's inspire you to look beyond surface appearances and appreciate the hidden depths of the people around you, please subscribe to our channel. Because every quiet hero has a story worth telling, every ordinary job might hide extraordinary capabilities, and every reminder that help can come from unexpected sources is worth sharing. Thank you for understanding that sometimes the person serving your coffee might also be the one capable of talking down armed criminals and saving lives with nothing more than the right words spoken at the right moment.